Ka mihi mahana kia koutou. It's a real privilege, quite a daunting privilege actually, to be here. It's my first time in Treasury. I hope it's not my last. I'm Bronwyn Hayward and I'm head of the politics department at the University of Canterbury. I think that there are four big challenges, but there are more. But for me, there are four big challenges which I think will define your lives. I think they are dangerous environmental change. And we've talked a lot about climate. But I wish that when I'd been writing about this, and I will write some more, that I'd been thinking also about the effects of mass migration, of war. The second, though, is around the weakening of democracies. So one of the huge challenges is how do local communities, nations and people hold global financial power to account? And what that feels like if you're living in Christchurch is what it feels like for homeowners. How do we manage to deal with international insurance companies, particularly when they seem to be, I mean, who knew we were the most deregulated insurance market in the world pre-quake? Certainly not most of Christchurch. We know now. And when you're trying to deal with international firms and their policies in your local community, that's huge. But how do we control financial investment, movement of capital, corporations that are bigger than our GDP? How do we actually hold these powers and organisations that we have operating within our countries to account? So weakening of democracy, and actually the fascinating resurgence around that is also really huge and won't go away. And neither will the growing social inequality. And I stress social inequality because we've talked about income inequality, but of course income is only one of the measures of inequality, and it is the opportunities, and they're the unexpected opportunities. John Uri, who's recently just died, fantastic geographer and futures thinker, he's written a lot about thinking about mobility as a marker of class, the new marker of class. Now, hands up, just out of interest, how many people in this room have two citizenships or access to two citizenships? Hands up. Right. Now, that is one of the most, your ability to be able to control your movement around different countries globally is a huge privilege and a marker of class. So this growing social inequality in ways we haven't considered, and of course in New Zealand we've been thinking a lot, although it's really happened only since 2010 that it's been a public debate about that gap between rich and poor, the pace at which it grew. Of course, we've done different things, different policies have been able to change it, niggle at it, chip it, what we did for families, but that actual gap is dramatic. And we are a little thin country. It's only us and Sweden that have really gone at that speed. And of course, Sweden came from a completely different philosophical base and way of thinking about how it was going to tackle it. And then the fourth problem that I think will completely define your lives and how you tackle it is unprecedented youth unemployment. I work a lot with, at the moment, with the United Nations and both UNICEF and UNEP, but also the development programs. And there's one stat that sticks in my head, which was just flippantly said, actually, although in despair, by the leader of Tunisia. For a 13-year-old in Tunisia, well, this was 2 years ago when I first heard it, to have a job when they're 23, just in that region, we will have to create 6.5 million new jobs. But get this, every year for the next 10 years. So when we're thinking about this mass migration that we're seeing at the moment, this mass movement, these are huge issues, and they are issues for children. We've talked about an ageing population, but half the world is under 25, and they're growing up in the places that will experience this extreme difference. And we are not an ageing population if you look at Māori and Pacifica. You know, we are not an evenly ageing population, and we are spread geographically, and we're very diverse in this tiny little part of where we are. In fact, who knew, although you will know if you live in Auckland, that the under 14-year-olds in Auckland are one of the most rapidly diversifying cohorts, urban, in the world. So we have a new project which we're setting up, which is following kids growing up in cities. But the reason that I chucked out all my notes, although I'll try and fit them under these 3 headings, and in 2 minutes, I'm sorry, is one of the projects that we did before, which is how I sort of ended up, I think, here, is following young adults, 18 to 35, in 18 countries. And it was a qualitative study of just listening to what they were saying, and we worked with 8,000 between 2008 and 2009, and it was in the golden era of blogging, when people were still quite happy about what they put onto a blog and Facebook, and it was all novel. And we were going for young thought leaders. We were people just like you, actually, young urban graduates, to see what they thought. And we were asking questions about their hopes and their greatest fears, their hopes, how they evaluated their lives today, and then some basic questions about energy and consumption and other patterns. And it was a very overwhelming project to work on. It was a huge privilege, and it really did change my way of thinking. Because one of the things that was overwhelming is just what it was like. The big statement that came through in lots of different languages was, I want to make a difference. And it was quite overwhelming to think about what it is like to be what we glibly call the neoliberal generation, which is you, and you are all the winners of that generation. I mean, you are it. And I've just been speaking at the New Zealand Science Futures Conference yesterday with the Rutherford winners, and in both situations I was sort of overwhelmed by, when you get to step back and listen, it's quite terrible, because you're so lovely, and you're saying, I want to be a change maker, a young entrepreneur, it's talent, fortitude, resilience, smart thinking. It's exhausting. It's exhausting being you, and you're the winners of this. And I want to think about the strengths and the weaknesses of what we've done. So, learning to listen across deep differences, given that that was my first thing that I was thinking. First off, I would say that this has been my biggest thing. Because of these rapid social and economic changes, we aren't listening to each other anymore. And we're not really listening. Now, that seems weird in an age of focus group politics. Everything is just calibrated to what the consumer, no longer a citizen, but the consumer thinks about, as we said, yesterday's policy, this morning's soundbite. But that's not listening at a deep level to our experiences. I mean, in the room we've got people who've been through wars, refugees, rural communities, urban, people have lived in really big cities and really tiny ones, and actually all of that, really different cultures. I mean, so actually finding opportunities to be together and listen is huge. And one of the things that really struck me listening to and interviewing kids is even between 3 blocks difference in small towns, I mean small towns New Zealand size, like medium towns, they may as well have been living different lives between the decile 10 child who, if they're not going to ballet, Kit McGrath, orchestra practice, UN youth, you've probably done a lot of it yourselves, they're exhausted, but they're doing all of this stuff and they're being run around in the SUV, and they've got, organised sport. And then you've got kids in decile 4 communities, or decile 4 within a decile 10 school, and they are got huge freedom to roam. They're still actually exploring the city on foot. They are completely playing differently. They may as well be in a completely different planet. And so in this situation, finding opportunities to actually really listen to life experience and reflect on other citizens is going to require a lot of rethinking about our structures and education. And at the moment, I have to say, I don't know where we're going as a nation. We just seem to be rudderless. Or some people seem to know where we're going as a nation, but perhaps we're not articulating it. And I think that matters because one of the most powerful things about this generation that you're part of is that if you're less cynical than I am about neoliberalism, then it is wonderful that there are so many people who feel strongly that they want to make a difference. But the difficulty is, and I think Kate touched on it, that if I was being really awful, the bit that was really chilling for me reading the New Zealand responses was that New Zealand young thought leaders were pretty smug and very isolated. And on the other side of it, they were so lovely that I was sort of sitting in a really cold winter in London crying through this data, actually, because I'm a parent of kids that were this, coming up to this age. And I brought our kids back with my husband to have more of what you've had, because even though they were smug and they were insular, they were confident. They stood out. Our little cohort of Snapshot, they expressed their politics in a very interesting way. All of this generation were talking about wanting to make a difference, but we talk about it physically. We talk about our politics as wanting to do stuff. And so the worst part of that was that New Zealanders, and this has been highly criticised, but this is what people said, spontaneously asked what the worst way of living was. A good third of this tiny snapshot of thought leaders said, no coordination, nothing, they could write anything on their piece of paper. My worst way of living would be, no kidding, to live in an apartment unable to do my outdoor lifestyle, actually, or variation thereof. And also asked where they would like to see themselves in 10 years. They were saying, I might be a vegetarian. I would like to maybe I probably won't, but I'd love to have some kids and kind of like a bit of space of land and do my own thing and have a community that really I value. So I think that productivity flat thing is, a lot of them already said, I am living the good life now. And it was at that point I thought, actually, I'm bringing my kids home for this. But this was a very privileged group and not the rest of our wider community. So how can we ensure that some of the best of what we've got is shared for others? And I've talked way over and haven't even got to the last two, so let's go very quickly then. The long-termism in thinking. How could we learn to live within limits? One of the interesting things is how can we actually change the way we think and talk about public policy so that we push the horizons out? Now, I think one of the things we need to do is to think about actually, in this situation of great inequality and difference and rapid change, we have to be self-conscious about the moments in which we talk. So we do have to think, and we also have to do that about long-termism. So one of the things is exactly what Kate was talking about. We need to think about public trust models or ways in which we can have public broadcasting, which I used to be on the Broadcasting Standards Authority, so I'm a bit passionate about this, but ways in which we can have opportunities to have an informed and diverse media that's not all internationally owned and it's not all driven by commercial imperatives. Because this is creating a very difficult situation in which we have very little space for actual public reflection. And we can't dump it all on schools. There's actually got to be a lifelong opportunity to have reflection, and it is quite dramatic, the difference between a British model of politics still and an American, if you wanted to see an exchange, where for all of its difficulties and inbuilt colonialism and all of its problems, the BBC as a model and the Guardian Trust as models provide a platform of shared information for at least a sector of the middle class that ensures you have a range of and more opportunities for informed debate. And if you look at the very scary polarisation now between the left and the right, the Republican and the Democrat, profiles of values in the states, we don't want to end up there. We want to have a way in which we're still listening to each other. Another way to think about it is also to think about legislative change that inbuilds a requirement to take the ideas of Treasury further. And who knew? I mean, what a strange time we're in, where Treasury is more socially liberal and progressive than perhaps our government at the moment. So we need to think about ways in which we can actually embed that long-term thinking. So Wales has just passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which requires that all new legislation is basically checked and debated against its consequences. And actually creating the structures in which you require some reflection and building those institutional models, that is a really basic but important visionary thing you can do. And it's my opportunity to thank Michael Cullen and Jim Anderton and others for models of superannuation, models of Kiwi Bank, ways in which we could start having investment in ourselves. What if we took that further? What if we thought about pensions and the way that we could invest it into education? We don't have to use yesterday's thinking of charter schools. And I'm sorry, I saw somebody was teaching first because, yes, I stalked you all through your thing. You know, what if we didn't say teach first? No offence, it's great, but why don't we say teach? Because actually, if you teach before you come back to work for the bank, if you teach, you touch the future. So finally on leadership, which brings me to how would we act in a way that might reclaim leadership, not as we're conceiving it at the moment, where there's all this on you to be the change, to be the young social entrepreneur in the market that's going to make the difference. But actually, if we are thinking about learning to live within limits, rethinking what our economics looks like, rethinking what our politics looks like, if we resist and we think differently about, really differently. So what if we don't continue with unlimited material growth? What if we don't have inclusive growth or green growth, but what if we say, look at the rates of which we are consuming at the moment. How are we going to create gaps and opportunities for developing countries and for innovation if we continue on these growth models? And we don't want to have it foisted on us by global fiscal crises or new environmental crises. We want to be able to think about what actually it would look like. What would it look like if we had leadership that is not us, individuals, trying to do this, being the change, exhausting as it is? And think critically about the conditions that enabled you to be here. The real conditions, the public education, which is not just a service, with due respect to David, but it is a capabilities, it's as Amartya Sen would say, the capabilities that we lift society. If we think more fully, these are not radical ideas. I mean, hands up who's heard about Adam Smith and the Hidden Hand and his book From the Wealth of Nations. Okay, hands up who's read his other book, On the Helping Hand. Thank you, Theory of Models. How many people knew he'd written 2 books? Yay, yay. Hands up who's heard of Darwin's Survival of the Fittest? Yay. Hands up who's heard of Darwin's Social Cooperation and Survival of the Kindest? Yay. A few. So actually, there are legacies and ideas on both the right and the left that you can draw on for resources. But if we are thinking about citizenship as a lifelong commitment, what it is to be and belong, not just represent, not just a contract, but actually the belonging and the participation, how do we frame that opportunity for yourselves and for others? Then that's starting to think more along Amartya Sen's ideas again about what we need for capabilities. And if you want to go further, a couple of great places to think about this outside the square. Read the 2 new Bridget Williams little $14.99 books I'm going to promote. Read Morgan Godfrey's The Interregnum, about the change that cannot, as Gramsci would say, it's the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. So there's terrific new thinking coming through. Read and contribute to that. Go and have a look at Andrew Dean, Ruth, Roger and Me. Could have been Michael, Bill and me, but it's the Ruth, Roger and Me of what it's like to be you. And think about the extraordinary power of ordinary people acting together to effect change. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou.